In flesh.
Okay. Good evening and welcome, everyone. This meeting is live streamed on YouTube, so you're welcome to. Elected members unable to join the meeting in person.
Continue.
Okay. Elected members unable to join the meeting in person are able to join remotely. However, they do not form the quorum. We will not be able to vote and their attendance will not be officially recorded, although their virtual attendance will be noted in the minutes. Non-voting independent members ideally attend in person, but if unable to join the meeting in person remotely, they retain speaking rights and wish to turn their camera on when asking questions. With regards to the meeting etiquette, please may I ask that you indicate you wish to speak by raising your physical hand. Please note that the chat function on Zoom will not be used in this meeting and questions or comments on the agenda pack should be raised by the chair. Before the first agenda items, I would like to thank Sir Brooker for presenting the annual report of the Audit Committee to the annual meeting of. Please note that the new terms of reference agreed at the last meeting of the Audit Committee were ratified at the annual meeting of Council on the 22nd of May 2023 on pages 9 to 12 in the agenda pack for your reference. As chair, I have agreed to take an urgent item of business because it is directly related to issues to be discussed tonight, detailed supplementary agenda. The item for discussion and is called the recent increase in the Bank of England's base rate and the impact of high inflation. So, agenda item 1, election of the vice chair for the municipal year. I would like to thank Councillor Terry Hall for his service as vice chair for the last municipal year. This position is elected annually, and I now call for nominations for the election of vice chair to the audit committee for the municipal year 2023-24. Are there any nominations?
So, Councillor Paul.
Is there a seconder?
I second it.
Are there any other nominations? Councillors, but still. Okay. Councillor Paul has been nominated to the role of vice chair. To the members in the room, may I see a show of hands that this nomination is agreed, please? Thank you. It has been agreed that Councillor Paul has been elected as vice chair for the year 2023-24, and may I add my congratulations. Item 2, apologies for absence and substitutes. Since the committee last met, the independent member Jazz Sassone has resigned from the committee for personal reasons. I would like to record our thanks to him for the time served and contribution. Are there any apologies for absence or lateness?
Councillor Penton for lateness.
Okay.
And Councillor Chowdhury.
Okay. Is there a sub attending for Councillor Chowdhury?
Yeah. Councillor Penton is the sub.
No.
Not for this.
Oh, yes. I've been advised of apologies from Councillor Chowdhury, substituted by Councillor Madeline Sorry. Councillor Penton. Oh, no. Okay, Councillor. They're on her way. Yes. Okay. Councillors to inform of any apologies for absence by raising their hand.
Slightly late.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm really sorry, Chair. Could I ask if you could just speak a tiny bit louder because I'm struggling slightly to hear. Would that be okay?
Okay. Item 3, declarations of interest. To those members who are present physically, are there any declarations of interest? Okay. Item 4, minutes of the last meeting. Members are requested to consider and agree the accuracy of the decisions and minutes of the last meeting of the Audit Committee held on April 12, 2023. To the members present in the room, may I see by a show of hands, are the accuracy of the minutes agreed?
I wasn't there.
Item 5, action log. The committee has been asked to note the contents of the action log and the actions to be closed at the meeting. Are there any questions on the report?
Chair, I do. Yeah, I sent you an email
Yeah.
just before the meeting, and it's referenced actions 146 and 162. One of the actions first became an action in February, and that was raised against annual complaints. The Director of Housing is saying, Chair, that the said person will appear in front of this committee in October. Bearing in mind the seriousness nature of the issues we raise with regards to residents, I think it's unacceptable, but we'll have to wait, 8 months to get a response. Also, Chair, one of the other actions relates to Victoria Street and issues around governance of this organisation. And again, Chair, I think it's unacceptable, but on 2 occasions, the said Director of Housing cannot find it in his diary to attend the meeting. And bearing in mind, we are here for residents, Chair, I would ask that this matters, I think it's unacceptable, Chair.
Could I just add that Darren Levy is on holiday on the next ordinary meeting, and I was contacted by the clerk and she said that he offered to send a substitute to the July meeting, and I said I prefer for him to attend in person in the October meeting. Conrad, please.
Yeah, perhaps I could just also add for the benefit of residents listening, so I entirely understand where council is coming from. In fairness, the date of the audit committee was changed relatively recently. It was scheduled for another date in July, and I can't remember the exact date offhand, and had that gone ahead on that scheduled date, Mr. Levy would have been available. Because it was rescheduled because of another meeting, it now clashes with his pre-booked annual holiday. So I think, in fairness to him, I mean, it's not a lack of respect for the committee. It's
thank you, Chair.
Business.
And I thank Conrad for those comments. I think it's very important, but those comments are noted because residents might see, 8 months to get a response from October. What have we done about it? But I think it's very important. But I put it on the record. And Chair, I thank Conrad for the explanation.
Councillor Pence and the committee, but it does strike me when you said you rejected it that actually maybe having an interim report from the deputy, given there will be another 2 to 3 months before you have the next meeting, might provide some use for the committee.
I'll consider that. Councillor Booker.
There are a number of items that have a target date that's already passed, but also don't have any comments within the comment or action taken part. I was just wondering if we could.
It's on 151, 154 and 155 answers are awaited. That's 2 of the ones that you spoke about. And 158 onwards are listed for the meeting in July. Soon as the answers come through for the 1154, 155.
Well, in which case, could we ask for them to be done because they're overdue and there's no comments in next?
They're overdue and there's no update, and that's not right. I agree. Specifically on 155, that discussion did take place at the scrutiny planning meeting earlier this week. So both committees, agreed that it's important the chair should meet, and we will facilitate that. I agree that the dates these were supposed to be done by is in the past, and there isn't an update here, and that's not as it should be. So
that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, to members present in the room, may I see by a show of hands if the report noted? I will take the urgent item in the supplementary report now. So item 13, the recent increase in the Bank of England's base rate and the impact on high inflation. I agree to accept this late item under urgency arrangements as it directly relates to the reports under consideration. There has not been enough time to prepare a written briefing to the question which was asked was, with the Bank of England base rate increased to 5%, relatively high inflation and the subsequent recessionary impact to the general economy and council, would you be able to get from Finance Officer the report on the short term and medium term high inflation rates, especially since the billed as a finance special, as well as a financial overview of the impact? It would be useful to be informed on those areas of the council which will be most vulnerable to external financial pressures. I have noted the references to inflationary pressure within the finance reports we are considering tonight, and I invite Officer Conrad Hall to brief the committee on any additional information in response to the question asked. Conrad?
Sure. So, yeah, thank you for this. And I agree, it's an important item, and what I'll do is provide a sort of obviously take questions as appropriate, and it may well then be sensible to come back with a fuller written report in due course. I think the first thing to say, very specifically on the Bank of England rate increase of 50 basis points this week, that doesn't really directly affect the council, and the reason for that is that it's not the base rate that affects individual mortgage holders, for example, that is most relevant to us. It's the long-term borrowing rate, because our substantial borrowing is on a long-term basis. Just to put some numbers on that, so that long-term 50-year Public Works Loan Board rate 1 month ago was at 4.77%. Last week, just before the Bank of England decision, it was at 5.09%. On Friday, the day after the Bank of England decision, it was at 5.04%, 5 basis points below the rate just before that decision. And the last time I checked, 9%. But my point hopefully is clear that that specifically affect us in terms of the cost. It does have a number of significant, I suppose what I might call indirect effects on the council. And the most striking example of that is if one looks at housing costs, in particular temporary accommodation. What we are seeing, in common, certainly across London and presume much more widely across the country, is as mortgage rates, individual mortgage holders rise, particularly those who are buy-to-let landlords, are tending to exit the sector. So last year, for example, we saw a 47% reduction in the amount of private rented stock available to us. And the kind of consequence of that, unless we intervene, and of course we do intervene, and I'll come to that in a moment, but the consequence of that is that in many cases that means their tenants on the sale of that property present to us in housing need, and we may have a homelessness to them. And because of the shortage of supply, the starting point, regrettably, but sometimes unavoidably, is they are placed in essentially nightly booked hotels, at substantial cost, because that is the only way we can meet the need. So the immediate impact, if you like, is on us is indirect rather than direct. Now there are plenty of other sort of examples on other services, but I think that one's most powerful and kind of illustrates the point. I mean, of course, we do intervene, so we have an existing acquisition programme, and we'll continue to do that, because the more stock we can acquire, obviously we've got a building programme too, which boosts the total supply. So rather long-term things. So by acquiring stock, meets our agreed financial metrics. We're not spending unwisely. Obviously, can avert that housing need. Keeps people in the homes that they have lived in many cases for some years. So it's socially desirable and on a purely financial basis, if that's avoiding us paying those commercial hotel rates. And just to be clear, the sort of sums we're talking about there, it's hardly a surprise, is it, next to the Excel Centre? I mean, if you want a room in there, that'll be £1,000 a week. And that's assuming there's not a big event at the Excel. If there is, you'll go quite some way above that. And most families, one room is not appropriate housing. Hotel accommodation is not appropriate housing, full stop. So clearly we will intervene in those sort of ways to offset that pressure. But the immediate effect of that increase in the Bank of England rate, is felt that way rather than in the costs that we bear. And it is also true, of course, that rates have been rising for some time. So although the figures I've given you over that last month or so are oscillating around about 4.8, 4.9%. If you go back a year ago, the long-term PWLB rate was more like 3.33%. We looked up 1 year ago as up today, but we're around about that rate. So clearly, that adds to our borrowing costs, not our borrowing costs on existing debt, because that tends to be fixed rate debt. So there's a portfolio of debt, there's some loans in there still that are probably around about 8% within the late 90s, seem like a very good rate to be offered. But, obviously, the rates we'll be paying now and using for appraisal of new programs, regeneration schemes, for example, the interest rates are higher, and in isolation, that impacts on the viability of those schemes. I think the offset to that that's important to understand is that what's driving this is essentially an overheated rental market. And so, because our model of regeneration is based more on retaining stock and using the rental income for that to cross-subsidise the social housing stock, as opposed to a for sale model, although the cost in your financial model for interest will risen significantly, so to date with rental income. And taken in the round, that hasn't tipped schemes from viable to unviable. Clearly, it's a risk we're highly alive to. You'll see many other such impacts across all of the council's business. Social care sector is probably the single most obvious example, where a lot of the companies running that are ultimately relatively highly leveraged, sometimes even private equity owned, and they will be facing increased interest costs, which in turn feeds through into increased costs from those borrowings to us. I'm going to stop there. That's a very broad overview. There's probably 100 aspects to that we could unpick, but I thought it'd be most helpful if I just gave that sort of starting overview, and then I can either pick up questions in the discussion as follows, if that's what you want, Chair,
Would be preferable.
or sort of build a sort of paper for a discussion in a subsequent meeting.
I think the point, so I prefer us to take it on track with time as well. So this late item will be noted to the members present in the room. May I see by a show of hands, is the discussion noted? Thank you. Item 6, Treasury Management 2022-23 year end and Q1 2023-24 update report. I invite the officer, Stephen, are you taking it for Anderson?
Yes, thank you.
I invite Stephen Wild to give a brief introduction to the report. I will then open. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Just briefly, this is a report we're required to provide to members, and we take it through the audit committee first before it goes to cabinet and full council. It is a requirement of the CIPFA Code of Practice on Treasury Management, and it's also a statutory requirement to do so. The chief, or the big main highlights I want to point out is that in terms of the budget, we made a £7 million underspend for 22-23. Treasury activities remained within prudential limits and prudential indicators and treasury limits that were set by full council. The strategy has remained to invest, to borrow short, to use investment, to use cash balances within the council to fund the council's capital borrowing requirement. And you'll see in the table 1 that the investments have come down from 239 million to 112 million, and borrowing has been on 100 million. Temporary borrowing that we've taken has increased by around about 100 million. So in net terms, it's the debt has increased from 558 million to 782 million, and this is because we've used investment cash balances to fund the increase in capital borrowing requirement, That's in line with good practice, and it's meant that we haven't had to borrow at elevated rates. We do see the trend, or we think that rates are elevated at the moment, whilst inflation is brought back under control. We still think inflation, it will, based on the MPC meeting last week, we think they'll remain elevated higher for longer, but the trend is downwards, and interest rates will follow suit. So we think, and this is a strategy we've pursued going forward, that we use excess cash, the council's excess cash, to fund that capital outlay, and then we'll use temporary borrowing whilst rates remain high. When those longer term rates come off, you've heard that they went up by 1.5% over last year. Once they start coming off, then we'll start funding it from long term borrowing. But we will take, going forward, we will review that position very carefully, and we may decide to take some risk off and do some long-term borrowing. But there is a balancing act to play in terms of making short-term budget savings and also trying to provide stability to the council's budget strategy by taking some of the risk off.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I'll now open the floor to questions.
I'll go after Liz.
Councillor Booker.
I have quite a few questions, but I think if I can choose three, if that's okay. When putting limits on our borrowing, one, just a clarifying thing, is that annually set by council? And why have we raised the limits so high when we're not forecasting that need? One of the questions. I was wondering if you could explain why fewer capital receipts than estimated in the 22-23 period were actually achieved, or not achieved, but happened, and why we forecast so many more than the strategy estimates is going to be the case. And is that a problem, or does that literally make it doesn't matter at all? So that's the second question. And then finally, why are we expecting a lower net income from service investment than last year, despite spending 3 times more, if I've understood that, which I might not have?
Sorry, on that first question, sorry, can you just repeat that one again?
So the first one was around the limits on borrowing and why we've put the limit up so high when we don't forecast that need.
Right, well, first thing, that there is capital slippage during the year. And this year was not untypical of previous years. But
yeah, sorry, it's a little difficult to hear.
All right, sorry. Yeah, I was just saying there's capital slippage during the year. So, so from what we forecast in the Treasury strategy, and also it gives us flexibility to refinance some of the low-bows, because we have to monitor them very carefully, that we would have to increase our overall debt level to refinance them if it was a benefit to the budget strategy. So that's answer to question one.
Andrew, did you have?
Yeah, just to very quickly expand on that. So in terms of why the limits are what they are, they're part of the Treasury Management Strategy Statement, which is part of the budget report in February. So that would have been February 22. And as Stephen says, that is linked to the capital programme budget at that point as well. So whilst there was improved capital delivery in 22-23, I think we spent something like 352 million, and that's significantly higher than in the previous 2 years. There's still quite an underspend against the original budget set, which would have been a sort of totality of the capital project set out at that point in time. You expect some slippage. I think that slippage is getting smaller over time from the council, but that's, I think, the chief reason for the difference you've identified there. So, yeah.
It's a huge difference, but it makes sense if it's also to do with having to, what's the word that you used about having to take the close off some loans and then take others and things.
Yes, if we wanted to refinance some,
Refinance, that was the word.
when the option date comes up,
Yeah.
which is what we review very carefully, that can involve paying a premium, but it's worth paying. Sometimes we're paying the premium on in order to get the if the replacement loan from PWLB is much cheaper, so it gives us a little bit more headroom to play with, but we do that in a measured way. Should we go down that road, and we would also consult very closely with this committee as well.
Thank you. And could you also explain the lower net income from service investment than last year? The percentage is like 1% lower than last year's one. It's part of the appendix table 7.
Yeah.
Perfectly possible that I've misunderstood it, but it looks like we're spending a lot more and having a lower net income.
Yeah, I think my own response to that, I'd have to look at it again and I'd come back to you, but I think it's just where the set up in terms of how the income stream comes through.
In terms of like where we are with different developments and things.
Yes, and some of them are, some are on a kind of J curve, they're slow. There's a development phase and then the investment phase, and that's when the cash starts coming through.
Okay, the spend is 3 times more and it's a lower net income, so that seemed to jump out to me, but thank you very much.
It will step up in future years. But
What's the expectation of the step up?
Yes.
So what is the expectation of the?
I'm got the figures in front of me, but I did notice a considerable pickup in later years when these developments come on stream.
Stephen, could I suggest that you provide that information to the committee so it's noted? Thank you. Councillor Paul, thank you. Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. My question is perhaps to link to Conrad's part as well. On section 4.3, financing the capital programme, Cabinet authorised up to £240 million in May for borrowing. But I believe an earlier meeting this year, the actual capital requirement for the authority is in the region about 427 million, approximately, willing to be. So therefore, how much with the current increase in interest rates, how much is our borrowing requirement going to cost us extra? Because that extra cost will have to come from our revenue. I'm just trying to get a fixed rate increase on the borrowing requirement.
Very roughly speaking, 5% of 400 million, 20 million pounds, isn't that? We can do an exact number. Point though, is that what's driving that borrowing requirement in very large quantity, and we'll get you the sort of breakdown, but it's housing development and is therefore linked to the income from that stream. And I think there's a sort of huge difference between capital investment in there solely to deliver services. So, if you borrow to improve the quality of the roads in the borough, or for schools or leisure centres, so something that doesn't generate an income, then clearly what's happening is you are paying the cost of that borrowing and need to find another source of financing it. If you're borrowing for a housing asset, and I'm not saying that things can't go wrong in housing developments, of course they can, but in principle what you have is a interest cost that, provided you've done your viability calculations with a sensible measure of prudence, as I think we do, that will be at least matched by the long-term income from that stream.
Just kind of go back there. So 35 to 35% of our developments in Newham are social housing, and the rents from a social house are below market. So in a sense, we're borrowing money at market, but then the return we're getting is sub-market. There's a differential between the two. So as interest rates go up, the actual financing, if interest rates go up, are we really profitable? Is that correct? Is that a correct assertion?
It's certainly a material risk.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what has happened to date, and you need to be careful, obviously, about projecting that too far forward into future. But what has happened to date is that rents have been rising by actually even more than had been forecast. There's all sorts of policy implications of that, and that may be a good thing or a bad thing according to your point of view. But I mean, financially, in our model, we had assumed this for interest rates and this for rents, and they both be crude explanation, but you get the point that I'm making. Certainly in terms of private development, we are seeing more and more developers not wanting to take things forward or looking to reduce the amount of social housing. We're still trying to hit that ambitious target of 50% affordable on our own schemes. A part of that is the need for government grant for that. I mean, the chief executive of the Housing Finance Corporation, the way he puts it, is subsidised housing, social housing needs subsidy, and either that is to be provided by increased grant rates, which by the way are low by historical standards. So the GLA or government or someone needs to provide a subsidy, because if you just look at it in financial terms, you would never build council housing. It doesn't pay for itself, because it's a subsidised product, so it's a subsidy. So that either needs to come from government grant, and the GLA and government need to look at their rates for that, or it needs to come from sub-market rates. So, for example, for 1 year only, couldn't make this up really, it's not the way I would do long-term financing if I was in charge of government policy, but there you go. For 1 year only, there is a reduction on the rate we pay for HRA borrowing to put it below that PWRB rate to try and deal with that. I mean, I think that might be quite a sensible policy, but it's just odd to do it for only 1 year, because it almost encourages you to go out there and sort of throw cash at a development, which is not a sensible way of running things. But whether by interest rate or grant or some other means, if you want social housing, someone has to provide a subsidy.
Just one final
fundamental.
Councillor Penton wants to come in as well.
Sorry.
Councillor Paul, you can also.
Oh, right. No, so because obviously I agree with you there, Conrad, but then obviously what we'll then have to do, there'll be a lag factor between getting the grant and the issue coming, and we'll, as a council, we might have to provision that. So essentially, as interest rates go up, social housing becomes less affordable, capital programme in a sense, but we'll have to provision that. But also, do you think we'll have to increase provision for that to manage that increased costs? And if we are, would that be a cash provision, or would we have to scale down the ambition in, let's say, a capital programme on building houses?
But you'd have to do one of, I suppose, 3 or 4 things, wouldn't you? Provided the rental market stays in its current somewhat overheated state, actually it's sort of working out okay, but one couldn't anticipate that forever. So when viability does become challenged, if, for example, government doesn't step up and provide longer term discounted rates or grant or whatever, then the things that you can do to make a development that has become unviable viable again is either to reduce affordable housing, or to look at reducing the total quantum of housing. So you keep 50%, but you build 900 units instead of 1,000 or whatever, and put sort of income generating assets on that part of the development. When those are the tools at your disposal, and if we get to that point, we will need to contemplate one or more of those things. It does depend on government policy about how they're going to continue to provide subsidy, because again, and quite a helpful phrase, isn't it? Subsidised housing, which is what council housing is, subsidised housing requires a subsidy.
Thank you. Final question, Councillor Thompson, please.
Yeah, and I'll just ask if this is the right place to ask it, because I didn't hear earlier about where we were going to the opportunity to talk about interest rates. Was there in this?
Yes, this is.
Okay. You said earlier that you saw the main impact of rising interest rates in the indirect effect on housing services because of the impact on landlords, either increasing rents and tenants couldn't afford them, or actually decided to sell the property, the mortgage payments, taking them off the market. So have we done a forecast where interest rates where they currently are at, and they may well go further? What the likely impact is going to be on our temporary housing budget because of that? Could be something we turn to where we have represented the housing, but there's a budget.
So we're in the process of finalising our sort of forecast for the first quarter of current financial year. Those will be reported to the Cabinet meeting of the 20th of July, and therefore the report on that will be published 7 days in advance on the 12th of July. So yes, we haven't quite finished running the rule over those numbers and seeing how we can try and mitigate the impact of the pressures that we face. But in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be in a position to publish those numbers.
But just to be clear, whilst you can't tell us the numbers now, go to Cabinet first, we should expect a further increase in our temporary housing budget.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen continued pressure there. As you would expect, we're then trying to do lots of things, for example, to work with them to avoid them making our tenants and so on. And it's sort of working through the impact of all of that we haven't quite concluded yet. But yes, I expect that there will be continued pressure there. We've also seen, continued increases in the rates being charged for the sort of emergency and hotel accommodation.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, but it's not just a volume thing. I think there's also the kind of price thing on the supply when we do commercial hotels. So it's a difficult issue.
Yeah, that was one. Yeah, it's the cost of accommodation with private landlords, but also it's how everything will be going up because demand will be outstripping supply.
Yeah, I mean, this is, in my view, I mean, this is an issue where government is going to have to find some way to step in. I mean, in the public domain, for example, Enfield published a report showing I think their figure was of the order of £20 million overspend on their temporary accommodation.
Speak up.
So I beg your pardon. Enfield Council earlier this month published a report disclosing, I think it was a £20 million overspend on their temporary accommodation budget. So it is clearly an issue that will be felt all across London. We're all subject to the same pressures. I think government recognises it. So earlier this month, they announced an initial 2.8, was it?
2.8.
Additional 2.8 million grant for homelessness prevention, which is trying to sort of contribute towards this. So government recognises it. I don't know that government yet recognises the kind of scale of the issue, particularly across London.
Okay, I'm going to have to put the item to a close. Thank you, Conrad. I will now read the recommendation. For reasons set out in the report and its appendices, the committee is asked to note the Treasury Management Outturn 2022-23, including the Prudential Indicator Outturn and the 2023-24 forecasts. The members present in the room, may I see by a show of hands, is the recommendation agreed? Thank you. Item 7, Going Concern Report. I invite the officer Minur Hall to give a brief introduction to the report. I can open the floor to questions. Andrew.
Yeah, I'll take this one. Thank you, Chair. So the Going Concern Report, I suppose the issue of whether councils are to be considered going concerns in years gone by didn't used to attract an awful lot of thought or attention, but that's considering what's happened elsewhere in the country, that's perhaps not the case anymore. So I think it's good practice to put together a report or statement like this, which particularly looks at the level of reserves and in particular usable reserves for the London Borough of Newham, and just to make clear that we consider the council to be a going concern for the 23-24 financial year. So The report does give detail on the reserves. I have spotted this earlier this evening. I do apologise. I've managed to mix up the words usable and unusable in that paragraph, and they should be swapped. So I do apologise for the error there. But well, the report just sort of takes you through and tries to sort of start with the big total for what is termed usable reserves, and actually some of those are usable, but only within very specific parameters, quite tightly defined. And the report also just includes some of the benchmarking information on reserves that's become recently available from the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, DLUC. Now that benchmark information was produced by London councils, and it is 1 year old, but nonetheless, I did think it was a sort of useful to give a sense of where we are in comparison to other London boroughs. So, as detailed in the report, the general reserve at the end of March stayed at £7 million. It does need to be built up, and I can refer back to budget papers where we've in fact budgeted for that to increase by £4 million during 23-24. And the report also talks about those earmarked reserves, which it would perhaps be, I suppose, if we needed to. So it gives, I think, the general reserve plus those ones that are detailed in the report gives a figure of the order of 21 million treatments to the statement at the end of going concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you.
Just a very quick question. For a council that wasn't a going concern, how would they manage this process? Would we expect to see more frequent reports? What would they do in a situation where they were concerned?
Yes, well, that's a tricky question. We could think of some councils in the public domain where this will be a real issue. I mean, I should add, I mean, in an incredibly strict technical accounting sense, councils would pretty much always be prepared on a going concern basis, because even in the case of, I'll name them in the public domain, Thurrock or Slough or Croydon or whatever, you don't have a fire sale of the organisation's assets in the way that if a company wasn't a going concern, you would. I mean, I think what you would expect to see would be, a significantly greater amount of public reporting. You would very likely have commissioners appointed who would be reporting into elected members and residents and others about the impact of that. You would, I'm sure, see a much larger and more public role from the external auditors for those councils where a Section 114 notice had been issued. You would see not just the expenditure controls from that, but a degree of formal reporting that would continue to happen on that. So, I mean, you'd sort of see an awful lot more of this, I suppose. I mean, I know that's not a terrific answer, but planning for us not to get to that point.
No. I think as audit committee members, the question would be, how would we know if we should be more concerned? Because everything that you've described is when it's in the public domain. With the high profile cases we've seen, that's when we know commissioners have come in. What should we as an audit committee be looking at? Think actually we may be in trouble.
So I think if I take you to table 1, I don't have the printed agenda, so I don't have the page numbers, but it follows paragraph 5.3.
Page 42, 43.
That's the total usable reserves of 541 million. Now, I immediately stress on that, some big numbers in there. So 200 million of that plus is capital receipts. So they're usable, but only for capital under accounting regulations. Further 60 odd million is unapplied grants. I mean, essentially, you've had a government grant to do a project, spent all that yet, so it sits on the balance sheet, but you can't use it other than to spend on that grant. So once you sort of strip those out, what you're left with is that general fund reserve, which at 7 million has been discussed considerably through the budget process, is lower than it should be, but we are trying to build that up over a period of 2 or 3 years. And the earmark reserves of 218. Those are scheduled out in table 2, which follows paragraph 5.7. And so you can see everything that's in there. You know, and there's a mixture of things there. So I'll pick out 2 examples to sort of illustrate the point. Schools balances of 27 million. We classified those in accounting terms as usable reserves in trouble with them, in cruise terms. But there are plenty of other examples in there where we have set money aside to do things. Small scale authority transition reserve, to fund transformational and other projects. One could not do those projects and use that money instead, in extremis to avoid getting into trouble. Treasury reserve, 20 billion, a significant sum of capital financing reserve, which is there to cover sort of the many risks on the capital programme. So if you strip some of the very strictly restricted figures out of that, you've still got a substantial figure. If the council was getting into trouble, you would be able to stop or delay various programmes and avoid the sort of section or situation that other authorities have got into. Obviously, you then have the consequence of not doing those good capital projects, but I mean, it is an alternative. So I suppose to answer your question, you'd want to see a table like that, that gave you that sort of assurance that, that we could deal with some things.
Thank you. Thanks. Could Councillor Seth come in, please?
Hello. So on the earmark reserves, just to understand it, so you're using 2.7 million of the overspend is being covered by the earmark reserves. Is it? You just mentioned that you repurpose them sometimes. Is that okay to do? Is there a risk that if it becomes an overspend, you're just going to use reserves that are earmarked for something else, and there could be. It doesn't matter if there's an overspend. We'll find a reserve somewhere that we might not need to use, but there's a bit of a slack then.
No, I know exactly where you're coming from, and I agree. I mean, we should not overspend. Let's just be completely clear about that. I think the position last year was understandable. We actually underspent if one excludes temporary accommodation, where we're facing a perfect storm of the housing market in London. Still rather we underspent overall, but I'm sort of somewhat more comfortable with that position. But it's not okay to just continually repurpose earmarked reserves. They're earmarked for good reasons, because we want to use them to fund future projects. We want to, small scale, for example, holding an insurance reserve allows us to self-insure for many items, which is cheaper than paying for the external premium. So if one depleted that reserve, you'd actually just end up spending more money over time. But it's not a good idea to keep running these down. The table is there to sort of make the point that in the event of a more substantial overspend, there would nonetheless be options available to us, so that we wouldn't be getting into that sort of section 114 territory that Thurrock and Woking and others have issued. It's not a good thing, I agree.
Thank you, Conrad. Councillor.
I'm just going to say, so the investor save reserve, the money that was earmarked for investor save, now you don't need it anymore, because it was saying that you'd said that there was investor save reserves that's been used.
The temporary accommodation.
Yeah, that's been a long-standing. That certainly was the original intention for that reserve when it was originally earmarked. I think we sort of reflected on the potential use of this through the budget monitoring through the year. The original intent certainly of that was to not for capital, but there was no particular specific projects in the short to medium term which that has diverted funds from. So
okay,
set up at a point in time, but was available for this purpose. Quite agree with comrades. Of course, it's not okay to continually do that sort of thing.
Thank you, Andrew. Councillor Booker, please.
So actually, I had questions that led off from both of those. So one is, if we we've now spent that invest to save one. Are we now, do we have earmarked reserves for temporary accommodation, bearing in mind that it's not going to go away, or is that something that we're still going to be repurposing and figuring out, or have we got a plan to be able to do it? And the other one is that I think it's about 14 million, that's kind of that flexible earmarked reserves to be able to use that you went through, and it's a really useful table. What is the actual mechanism for those? How do we decide to use them?
So we don't have a reserve set aside specifically for temporary accommodation, but we do have contingencies in the budget. So I suppose that's just another way of expressing the same thing. So to some extent, any overspends could be offset against those contingencies. Obviously, I would rather not have to do that at the start of the year, but the scale of the issue that we face means that we may well have to. Really, you want to kind of hang on to your contingency because you don't know what's going to happen in the rest of the and then, I mean, in terms of the how, the practical operational decisions on reserves sit with me, supported by the finance team. Obviously, we report them into the audit committee and quarterly into cabinet, including showing how those reserves have been allocated. So there's clear member level oversight of that, but the practical day-to-day decision sit with me.
Because there will have to be decisions for some things not to happen. If are you able to say this needs to happen, or does that have to be a political decision?
No, I mean, if we get to the point, and we're not there yet, but if we got to the point of having to say, we will need to repurpose some reserves, such as a capital project, for instance, cannot happen or must be delayed for 6 months or whatever, then according to the scale of that, I mean, I make very low level decisions on that. Anything above the council's decision threshold would require political decision making on that. It's not for professional officers to decide which project should or should not go ahead. That's properly the domain of political decision making.
Sorry, Conrad, is it possible to provide the committee with a copy of the reserves policy? Is there a dedicated policy, a written policy on the reserves?
We've got sort of notes on how each one is intended to be used. I mean, I probably wouldn't call it quite as formalised as a policy, but we'd certainly find to share that.
Oh, thank you, Councillor Paul.
Thank you. I've got two questions. One on 4.1 and one on reserves. Just because, Andrew, you said 4 million was going to go into the reserves each year, but the report says 3. So can you clarify what is the policy, please?
So I think you're referring to the budget setting report back in February.
No. You just said, when you gave your report, you said, I'm going to be corrected, but I thought I heard you say £4 million was going to go into the reserves each year, replenish the reserves, but in section 3.2,
okay,
3 million.
Yeah.
My question is, what is it, 3 or 4?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't say how that's coming back. So in the budget and the medium-term financial plan, there is 3 million in the budget to be added to for the financial planning. Also in the budget report in February, we were taking £1 million from the collection fund reserve, having assessed where the collection fund reserve should be, and reallocating that into the, that's certainly my recollection. Okay. So that's the additional £1 million, and that would just be for 23-24 only. Okay.
To go back to Councillor Chadder's question, what would be the warning signs for a resident to ask further questions? Surely one of the concerns would be the level of reserves, right? Because if you're telling us in the report we should be at £18 million for 23-24, I note in the table we are at 7, which is at 38% of that figure. So would you agree, for a resident, that will be not a red flag, but that will be an issue for concern? But we haven't, for a resident would say, that's their rainy day money, right?
So, for residents watching, The February report, which went to Cabinet and then the full council. There's a section in there referred to as a Section 25 statement. So that's under Section 25 of the 2003 Act, which I, as the council's statutory chief finance officer, required to produce each and every year as part of that.
Yep.
What that does set out two things: the adequacy of the reserves and the phrase in the legislation is the robustness of the budget estimates. In other words, it's a budget sort of soundly constructed. And what that says in terms, and I would urge people to read it, but essentially that the current level of reserves is lower than it should be. No question about that. They were used up, in my view, very appropriately during COVID to meet the needs at that time. And the plan is to replenish them to the required level over the next 3 years with a contribution of 3 million a year in order to get to at or around about that level. Not perfect. The alternative of doing it quicker is, of course, to take other money away from service. Okay. But a reasonable balance to be struck there.
It's fine, because I remember your Section 25 statement, but obviously if we're saying in this report, and it says a benchmark guide for local authority on unearmarked general reserves is 5% of the net budget requirement, which for Newham would equate to over £80 million for 23-24. So for a resident reading that and then seeing we haven't got 18 million, despite your statement, for a resident who would equate it as rainy day savings, that would be an issue for concern, even though you have said from your professional view, we're okay.
I suppose the way to think about it, though, there is a difference between having enough reserves but no budget to contribute towards them, because then every time something happens, your reserves dip below that level and you need to, crudely, cut some other service to create a budget to replenish them. The situation we have, not ideal. We have fewer reserves than we would like to have, but we budget each year to spend less than the total amount of income we have coming in, 3 million a year. So there's that sort of headroom, and we will use that 3 million to contribute to those reserves each year. So the point I'm making, you can't just look at the single static figure. It's a position we're in, unlike some other councils, is that we're also
when we're starting the budget this year, the budget process, are we starting at the position of £3 million goes into the reserves, then we look at the budget, or will we look at all the different budget issues and then decide whether we've got 3 million? Which will it be?
I can't imagine circumstances in which my advice would be to go below that 3 million contribution.
Thank you. And could we, sorry, Chair,
Councillor Penton, please.
Well, it's just to follow up on that. Again, it's just, it's always a go back to what Councillor Chadder was saying about red flags. So we've set a target that we're going to replenish the general fund, and I'll take the point that we shouldn't put the general fund in isolation, but nonetheless, the reason why it's there is that we don't need the general for things that hit us like COVID. Homelessness. So we've got a forecast to build it back up to the level, which is 5% reserves, 18 million. We took more out of the general reserve last year, so it went down on the note. If we don't hit our 3 million target this year, should we regard that as a red flag? It's something that, it's a trend, it's 2 years in a row. That is something, as councillors, we should step back.
Yeah, I think it would be something one could debate whether it's a red or an amber flag, but I think your point is the right one. That would clearly be a warning sign, that if that had been 2 years running where we had not managed to make that contribution, I think one would reasonably say would be a cause for concern.
Thank you.
Let's hope we don't get that.
Final quick question, Councillor.
Not even a question, but a request that might not be necessary. I was, when I was reading this, there was a bit that talked about historical, how we've done historically, and that, you know, that we have even, you know, that we've, the amount of savings that we've managed to actually achieve and that sort of thing. And I think it links in with what other people have been saying, that it would be really useful. And I know I like pictures rather than words, but like to have a graph that actually has past years and the budget and balance kind of achieved and expected, and also the savings achieved and expected, because actually that would be something that we could then really use to say, in previous years we've managed to do this, then we've got a higher expectation.
Okay, could I add clarification to that as well? Just a quickie on that, because it was actually my question on section 4.1. There's a mention of £19 million of detailed efficiencies and savings which need to be delivered in 23-24. Just to add to what Councillor Booker said, can we have an update, a RAG rated? Well, can we?
Yes, 20th of July cabinet. That's what
Lovely.
Part of that.
Thank you, Conrad.
We're bringing this item to a close now. So I'll now read the recommendation. Audit Committee is recommended to note the contents of the going concern assessment as summarised in the report. The members present in the room, may I see by a show of hands if the recommendation agreed? Thank you.
Oh.
We now have light.
We have lights.
I'd like to bring light wherever I go.
Thank you very much.
Okay, noted. That was so. Could just, as Councillor Booker was moving, could we see by a show of hands, please? Thank you. Item 8, draft external audit plan, signed by Officer Andrew. I will then open the floor to questions.
Sorry, Chair, it's me.
Chair.
Sorry, we do apologise.
Hey, please.
Yes. Well, this is just the covering report for the external audit plan that our external auditors CY bring every year. This is for the new and main audit. For the next committee meeting, I think they're bringing the pension fund audit. So it's just outlining the areas that they're looking at and any new areas of risk. I think I would like to say in the report that they have lowered the risk on our PPE because of the work that the team have done to support the figures in the accounts. And they've identified a few new risks. So if I can introduce our colleagues from EY to run through the actual audit plan and then answer any questions that members may have.
Can I just ask for a quick clarification, particularly if watching from home? Can you just explain what PPE is?
Oh, sorry, I do apologise. Property, plant and equipment are fixed assets in layman's terms.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. As says, this plan sets out the intended approach for the external audit of the 22-23 financial statements. Clearly, the plan is produced at a particular point in time, and that will continue to evolve throughout the of the 22-23 pages from page 57 of the pack, or page 5 of to page 60 of the pack, or page 8 of my report. We set out there a dashboard of the audit, highlighting what has changed from the prior year. So taking those items in turn, misstatement due to fraud and error and inappropriate capitalisation of revenue expenditure, members will recall that those are standard, significant or fraud risks, not a reflection on the authority, but under auditing standards, auditors are required to pay more attention to those particular areas. Again, similar to prior year, we have a particular focus on the valuation of property, land and equipment, because those represent large numbers within the council's financial statements, and there are judgments which go around those. As Munir alluded to on page 50 or page 6, one area of property, plant and equipment which has been reduced in risk is those around other land and buildings which are valued on a depreciated replacement cost basis, which particularly relates to school buildings and leisure centres. The reason for that is historically we've not identified errors in those particular areas, and also those that approach to valuation is slightly more straightforward than some of the other. In terms of the valuation of council dwellings, again, there's no change in the focus there in terms of our intended. As every year, we also pay particular attention to pensions, and again, large number within the council's balance sheet that can be influenced by very small changes in the assumptions that feed into that derived number for the purposes of the statements. Two new areas of focus for the year on page 59 or page 7 are recoverability of loans with related parties, and indeed the council's approach to bank reconciliation in relation to loans. We've highlighted that as a new inherent audit risk due to the level of those and level of increase. Some work in relation to our audit in 21-22 and some findings there in relation to one particular element. Of course, as we've heard earlier in this meeting, the current economic environment also is important to take into account. We've de-escalated two further areas set out on page 60, which is in relation to the adoption of IFRS 16, as that continues to be deferred, and also infrastructure assets, as there is a temporary solution in place there, and committees heard from with Conrad and myself on that matter previously. One other area to draw to committee's attention is the level of materiality. So the materiality for 22-23, which is the level which will drive our work, is based on the same percentage. So there's the same methodology that's been applied to previous financial year. Importantly, for the purposes of the committee, we'll report any differences identified through the audit of 1.4 million. And then that's the quantitative aspect. Any qualitative differences which I judge are important for the committee will also be back in our audit report. There are two new auditing standards set out on page 63, which impacts the work that auditors need to do in terms of the risk assessment, ISA 315, and also our responsibilities in terms of having due regard through our work to the arrangements which management has in place to detect and prevent fraud. And then finally, in terms of value for money, we have yet to complete our planning on value for money, but perhaps as committee has noted in here, one of the key areas aligned with the three criteria will be giving consideration to financial sustainability, again linked to the current environment. So the conversation which members have just had is particularly relevant. Timeline we've agreed with management for audit of the 22-23 financial statements and reporting by 30th of September, which would achievement in terms of the rest of a large number of authorities across England. So, Chair, let me pause there. I'm happy to take any questions.
Councillor Chadder, please.
Sorry, not what the question for yourselves as auditor, but maybe for officers who can help. What's Future Newham? Sorry. Future Newham. Is that a project or a company or?
Set in, check the exact date, 2016, 17, something like that, to acquire and hold some 200 odd properties, not too far from here actually, and has just sort of operated as a subsidiary company on that basis since. We are actively considering kind of future use of that properties. We've got a vehicle that at the moment is just fairly sort of, static company, but that's what it is.
Sorry, I didn't drop.
I'm really sorry.
Property, sorry.
Sam ground.
Yeah, I mean they're near here. I think
The West Ham Football Club.
Correct, that's fine.
yeah, some 200 odd properties.
Right, okay, thank you.
Councillor Paul.
Yeah, thank you for the. I want to take you back to Popular Homes. In the report, you say certain loans have breached financial covenants, and due to the economic environment, the loans may not be recoverable. Can you give us a little bit more detail to that, and also in in supporting what you're about to say, are you able to provide a written update to what you found?
So I'll start. I think Conrad will want to come in relation to the specifics. But in terms of the audit, so the results of the audit and the results of that particular area of our work will be reported back to this committee as part of our audit results report. So that will come probably around about September time as you consider the financial statements for approval. So that will come back. In terms of the risk there, then while there's some specifics in relation to this authority, it is an area where our regulator is expecting us as external auditors to pay much more attention because of the economic environment and some of the challenges with loans being recoverable to related parties. In terms of the specific on the loan covenant, it was a very specific element of one of the loans, and probably
okay, can I just, are you saying your regulator has issued specific advice to you? So when you're auditing a council who has a property company, there are special rules which apply?
No, it's ultimately my judgment as the audit partner, based on the general observations of the regulator, both examining the quality of public sector audits and also commercial audits. And I am aware that in terms of the public sector audits, there has been an increased focus and in the expectation of the regulator around the recoverability of loans, which I don't think is unreasonable in the current environment.
What do you define as recoverability?
So whether the borrowing, which has been advanced, can be repaid.
So you're using your words here, you're saying there's a risk the loan will not be fulfilled.
That's the audit risk. I'm not saying that risk exists. I'm saying that is the audit risk that would need to be reflected within the financial statements if it was not recoverable. And it would also need to be reflected within our consideration of the value for money assessment, particularly at the criteria I mentioned around financial sustainability.
Okay, thank you, Conrad.
Very briefly to add to that, hopefully in a sort of fairly plain English way, quite rightly in my view, we borrowed substantial sums to try and instigate a much needed house building programme. That's a necessarily risky activity because housing development is necessarily a risky activity. What's the point of having an external audit if you don't then expect them to look at that and provide you with that assurance that, as I think the answer will be, yes, the council is aware of those risks and is managing them appropriately. So the auditor will form his view on that. So I think it's just really important to emphasise this is auditors' plan, and they're highlighting areas that they should necessarily focus their audit on.
Back to a question which Councillor Chadder asked. How do we know you're adequately managing the risk? Because in front of us,
because you'll have an international accounting firm
who has said it's an audit risk, not an inherent risk. I don't quote.
So if I can back to that question was asked earlier and emphasised again, Councillor, I think for elected members, it's about triangulating different sources of evidence to form your view. So there will be reporting from management in different places. There will be other external reporting that you will be aware of. There might be work by internal audit that you will be aware of that impacts the control environment. And then an important source of assurance will be the report that I issue at the end of the year, particularly around financial sustainability. Then that will give you another source of assurance or not. Triangulating all of those would then allow you to take a view in light of some of the questions you were asking.
Conrad, please.
One quick thing to add. The committee will be aware that Grant Thornton, the accountants, issued a report setting out in their view 5 common themes behind the sort of public interest reports that we have seen at Croydon and Thurrock and elsewhere. At the last meeting of the committee, you received the assessment back in respect of 2 of those themes. from the internal audit work that we have done. The next on the list, and actually work that is underway at the moment, is looking at the arrangements in place for managing subsidiary companies. In other words, precisely this area. So, we'll arrive to that. That's part of our sort of governance process is to think about the activities we undertake, to think about what's going on in the wider sector, and test ourselves as to whether we're doing it right. And obviously, you will also have, in due course, the report of EY as our external.
Thank you, Conrad. And Councillor Penton, please.
Just kind of a little bit, just so I'm clear, as a new member of the committee, for you're external auditors. I mean, those are the two issues: are recoverable loans with related parties and recoverable loans with related parties and bank reconciliation. You flagged up that I read this as the two greatest areas of potential risk.
No, just to clarify, they're flagged because they are new this year. So they're given a degree of focus because they are additional areas or additional higher inherent audit risks for the audit. They're not greater than any of the others. The most significant risks are the ones I referred to around misstatement due to fraud or error, inappropriate revenue recognition, and elements of the plant and equipment. From the audit perspective, the most significant risks because for various reasons.
Okay, so it's because it's read as it's new, so it's something new.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, that's fine. And in terms of then, if we go back to what you would do as the greatest area, potential area of risk, this is not working out. Go back up to that.
Councillor Penn. My turn now. Would you speak up?
Sorry, I was talking. I was trying to get my computer to work. It's now my powers of my mumbling worked. Sorry.
Are you done?
Yes.
Okay.
So the areas you just identified as the greatest areas of potential risk. So again, what do you think we should be looking for in there as members of the audit committee?
So in relation to the first area of significant risk, which is a fraud risk, that's misstatements, fraud or error. Auditing standards tell me as an external auditor that if management were to choose to manipulate the financial results, they would most likely do it through overriding controls, not be operated. That's not a statement of position here.
It's just a general statement.
General statement. And therefore, as auditors, we're directed to do more work in that particular area around significant or unusual transactions, around journal entries, and around associated controls in those areas. So in terms of one source of assurance you would receive would be our report that comes back. And that's not an area historically, so most recently, that we've raised any findings of a material nature. But also, again, you have an internal audit functions that looks at a number of those related controls again, so that's another source of evidence. In terms of the inappropriate capitalisation of revenue expenditure, again, we'll report back on the results of that testing as part of our overall results report later in the year. So again, that will give you evidence of our view in relation to that. Again, while we've had some findings around revenue in the related to and don't tie to any thought from us that that's a deliberate attempt to results. And then again, in terms of the valuation of property, plant and equipment, we will report back on the work that we do in that area, which will give you an insight into any findings and the amendments that management has had to make or chosen not to make as a part of the audit process.
Sorry, Conrad, can I just ask, is there any training coming in the next few months just to sort of give a bit more of an overview of how the audit works, what they're looking for? think that might be useful to get an understanding.
We can absolutely provide that. I mean, one of the things that's scheduled on the work plan, but I personally think is a really healthy discipline, is the audit committee's own review of its own effectiveness, as a means of highlighting, amongst other things, where you think you need more audit support from officers or indeed training. If this is a particular area that the committee's concerned about, I'm sure we could arrange a relatively short notice if it is helpful, a kind of additional training session on that, possibly with R and EY to support that a bit and explain from their perspective how all that works. So we'd be happy to facilitate that, and we'll find a date that works.
That would be helpful, because I think just the understanding of how you're detailing the risk, what that means and how that supports the audit committee in looking at those areas and what you're actually trying to do as what the role of the external audit is would be helpful for people to fully comprehend, I think, as the internal audit.
Particularly because the way that the red, amber, green is used is probably how you always use it, but it is different to how a layperson would look at it and assume what those colours meant. So
Chair, there is a contradiction perhaps, because you said in answer to Councillor Penton, it's red quotes a new risk, popular, right? But in the rubric, you actually point to some of the loans have had breached financial covenants, which is an inherent risk, not an audit risk. So what, can you give us some flavour? Look, in this bit, the bullet point, right? So you said it's audit risk and inherent risk, right? Audit risk is it's new, it goes up. But here you've actually pointed out where you found a risk. So what were the breaches of financial covenants, please?
Well, I think that was the point that Conrad got.
Right.
Conrad, please.
So the total loans, as set out there to Populo, are clearly substantial, 279 million as at March. So, the general point, of course, one would expect the external audit to focus on that. A relatively small proportion of that, I'm just trying to find the exact figure as we speak, I may not get to it, but a relatively small portion of that relates to one block where at the council's request, the block was originally purchased because the original intent of Populo was to provide sort of an income subsidy, and it's now been shifted towards more social housing. At the council's request, the company changed the use of that block post its acquisition from sort of private rented subsidy generating, cross subsidy generating accommodation to temporary accommodation. That has the effect, inevitably, of course, from the company's point of view, of reducing the income it receives from those units, and indeed potentially to the valuation that one would place on that property. Some of the covenants in the loan that were set up in 2016-17 or something like that relate to what would be called your sort of income cover. So in other words, you want a substantial proportion of income in relation to the loan. You'd want the loan to value ratio to be above a certain proportion and so on. So what happened was, at the council's request, and we own 100% of the company, save money on temporary accommodation costs and associated matters, we asked the company to change that. They did, in consequence of which some of those covenants are now no longer met on that one particular loan. One has to look at this in the round. The consequence of that, the company, an issue, council, of course, has not been incurring significant temporary accommodation costs in consequence of that. So,
I've got
obviously this will be a matter for the audit, but I think it's just important to emphasise what's going on there.
Yeah, that just a follow-up question. It's quite important. So, where is let's say we took the loan out and there's a subsidy somewhere. Fair enough. Where is that subsidy? The loan is not performing as it's set out, as you explained, right? Because we put temporary accommodation in. So that loss of the additional cost to us as the council or Popular because of that, where is that being held? Surely that cost should be held by the Temporary Accommodation Directorate? And if so, their actual overspend is worse than what it is.
No, that's not the case. The loss sits in the company. It's a separate legal entity, although we own it. So yeah, they've continued to make all the interest payments due under that loan and so on. Yeah, the point is that the loan to value ratio that they were supposed to maintain and one or two other similar ratios are now below the amounts that were set in the original loan agreement from the
Lost money. Popular has lost money because they've asked them to do something.
Well, I mean, I don't agree with the use of the word loss money. Yeah, it has continued to make all the interest payments that are scheduled under the loan. That has not changed at all, but the valuation of the property, for example, is now lower than was forecast, and so the loan to value ratio for that loan is not as it was intended to be. A commercial lender might have a serious issue with that. From the council's point of view, these are all part of the council group in any event. We've continued to receive all of the income due from the company and made a saving on the temporary accommodation budget.
We'll have to take Councillor Penn.
I haven't got the answer to my question, Chair.
I think.
So, I mean, I think there are two ways forward, Chair, or possibly three. I mean, one is to try and continue the conversation.
No, we'll be running out of time.
Second way is for a sort of further written update to be provided. The third way, bearing in mind that this is the EY's plan in conducting the audit, is you might want to listen to their view on the matter in September.
Can I come in, as it was my point? Actually, what I was going to request was you talked around, it'd be quite useful if you just gave us a short paper explaining the background. So
do that, providing it's rewind in any event.
basically, case study of what happens when a loan is repaired, and we could choose that. I think it's something I'd like to read on and think about rather than.
Happy to go into it.
And in that note, we have a copy of the board minutes, please, where that decision was taken. Because it seems what we've done, we have a separate company which is set up at arm's length to the council to take just like quasi-commercial decisions. The council's come along, taken an impaired decision, which has affected, let's say the financial position of the organisation. And I want to know who and where has that cost been incurred. And I would like a copy of the board minutes where that decision was taken and how it was taken, please. And in that note, I would like to see the flow of incomes between the loan.
This has been the case for at least the last 3 years, if not longer. The decision was taken some considerable time ago. If the committee really wants, I can have a look for the records that may exist around the taking of the decision back in 18 or 19 or 20, whenever it was, 2 or 3 years ago. If you really think that's important to you, or again, as I say, you will be having an international firm of accountants looking at the matter.
Will they be looking at the board decision making around that loan? No, you won't. They won't.
Have a look for what records years ago as to the decision.
That's useful, Conrad, and I thank you for that. And the reason why I was particular on that, Chair, is because we've got an issue of an impairment, and it's coming down to, we've asked an outside body to do something. We're not sure, well, I'm not sure based on what we've heard, where that loss is being taken and a financial impact, and also the decision on the decision making. So I thank Conrad.
I think that will be made clear in Conrad's note. So we need to move on now. So I will now read the recommendation. Audit Committee is recommended to note the contents of the report and comment or make recommendations to the Corporate Director on the level of assurance provided by the plan. For the members in the room present, may I see by a show of hands if this recommendation agreed? Thank you. Item 9, draft statement of accounts 2022-2023. I invite the Officer Andrew Ward to give a brief introduction to the report, and I will then open the floor to questions.
Yeah, if I may, just a couple of words from me first, if that's all right, and I shall be brief. Firstly, just for the minutes, if I may, I'd like to put on record my thanks to Andrew and to Mania and the team for producing the draft set of accounts. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes into it behind the scenes. I'm just very grateful that it's been prepared here. I think I ought to say, and this is, absolutely not a criticism of the team. The date for which these should have been produced is 31st of May. The information we have across the sector is that of the order of 20 to 25% of authority of compounding national issues in accounts and auditing that I won't go into all of the detail of. So the fact that we're slightly late actually puts us pretty well placed among local authorities, and I think it was the right decision to schedule to take it here rather than to try and produce an inferior product more quickly. But that was my call. The only other point that I just wanted to highlight at 3.B in the report, you'll see there's the issue of the outstanding certificates on the accounts going actually back to 2014-15, not 16-17. Just to update on that, I've had, in response to raising that issue, very helpful responses from PwC, from EY, and also the National Audit Office and Public Sector Audit Appointments. I'm hopeful that matter will be resolved soon, but it is a very historic issue. Just to update to that.
Thank you.
Then hand over to Andrew.
I'll just say as well, Andrew and Munir, on behalf of the committee, we thank you for your hard work preparing the accounts. We all know that it's a difficult job and the deadlines are quite tight. So if you can relay that back to the wider team. So to say the audit committee is grateful for that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. So in terms of producing these accounts, we take a deliberate decision to make sure we had them ready both for this meeting and also for the external audit, our colleagues over to my left, which was planned to begin in July in any case, so not in the beginning of June. So the sort of real terms of impact, there isn't really much in terms of a real terms impact in terms of missing the statutory deadline. What will happen next? So we publish these accounts for the committee on our website. There is, of course, a note saying that the accounts are due to be published on the website shortly. And what we'll do tomorrow is make sure that the draft accounts following this meeting are published online there. The accounts themselves, so there is the narrative statement in which there's some detail about the overspend, about our improved rate of capital delivery and spending on that. And that's followed by the main statements, as you'd expect, and then goes on to all the various notes to the accounts. And I can't really talk to all of those in this meeting here. The probably sort of noteworthy, I think, picking up on a comment from EY earlier, just about the pensions liability that has reduced significantly from one year to the next. So now, so I think in recent years that has gone across council, has been a far worse position, sort of 80% funded in some councils, and we're now at 100% funded on the pension fund, which I think is a very welcome news indeed. Elsewhere, so the notes to the accounts, there's not an awful lot new there in terms of the format. You'd be quite used to, I think, more experienced members of the committee will be used to the format. And the heritage assets are doing a note about the Buxton table as well, although a value for that has been included. It's a difficult asset to value in terms of monetary terms, but it's absolutely quite rightly we were pulled up on that last year, so we're consistent. I think that's pretty much all I'll say on that. We are closing in on final sign-off of the 21-22 accounts. There have been some national issues delaying the sign-off there, not least infrastructure assets, which we did talk about earlier. And yeah, we're closing in on the final sign-off of that, and we'll report that to committee as soon as that happens as well. To take questions, or Mandy, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean that needs to be before we publish them, because we have noticed some of them ourselves. So this will not be so this will not be
11, there's this chart about directorate, yeah, and you've got Populo down the bottom. In terms of consistency with regards to external companies like, you know, pest control, blah, 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 would it not be more consistent to use the other companies there as well, rather than talk about just Populo? This one here, page 19 on capital investment.
Oh, on the.
Yeah, yeah. You seem to in the report always talk about Popular, and I can see why, because of the size. But I'm reading the report. I try to get a feel for those. How can I describe this? All those external companies, which could be like a special purpose vehicle sitting out there. How do I get a view in the accounts? Maybe I'll just a point. If you're trying to get a view of the externals, what's the size of them?
Yeah, just to, so I found the table, it's on page 7 of the accounts themselves. Sorry, it's just I'm not working off the same page.
Sorry.
That's so that is a summary of the capital expenditure by directorate. So it lists the directorates, and then underneath the council total, there's another total, another 2 lines. The housing revenue accounts, there's significant capital spend in the housing revenue account, and then there's the loans given to Populo to capital as well. So I think that's the sort of appropriate reporting for our capital expenditure. That's where the significant capital expenditure
I'm not getting
accounted for within the table.
Yeah, I can see why you've done it because of the size of Popular. But if you're trying to get a feel for all the capital expenditures for all the other small businesses, then you wouldn't get that information, would you? Because it's not listed.
Right.
So I think that there are 2 ways of answering that. I mean, one, the narrative summary is a summary, so we highlight the principal areas in there. The other I would direct you to is note 38 to the accounts. That's page 78 of the document. I'm not sure what page that is on the printed agenda, my apologies, but if I just pause for a moment while people get to that.
What was that again? What page?
Note 38, which is on page 78 of the sort of numbers at the bottom, if you see what I mean, but not
91 of the pack.
191.
So you've got a list on that page and over the next couple of pages as well of all of the companies, their approximate scale, names of directors, where you can get copies of their financial statements from, but obviously if you want them, we'll just get them for you. That's no problem.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Thank you, Conrad.
Thank you, Conrad.
Any further questions? Councillor Booker.
Are you able to share with us the response to your letter, or is it something that can't be shared in a public?
I don't think there's any problem in disclosing it, but I mean, essentially, so I've had a discussion with the National Audit Office and the public sector accounts audit appointments, rather than a letter. I've had discussions with PwC as the auditor, an email rather than a letter from them. I'm sure there'll be no problem disclosing it, but essentially it says, yes, we are working with EY. I understand that there was a meeting between the 2 firms of auditors last week just to try and iron out the technical details of who signs what. And Mr. Reid may be able to add to that if needed. I don't think there's any problem in sharing that, but there's not a great deal.
A timescale? Have they given you a timescale?
Is there a timescale?
Well, the timescale is not in our gift. Timescale is in PwC's gift. It goes back to the 15-16 financial statements for which.
So the letter went to PwC as well. So I'm wondering whether we got anything back to suggest a timescale.
Well, let me guess it. I mean, they haven't committed to a specific date, but they have acknowledged the fact that it is outstanding and has been outstanding for longer than it ought to have been, and that they are working hard to get that resolved. I'm just looking for the actual letter to quote, if you want to bear with me for a moment.
Yeah, sure. Is this something that the Financial Reporting Council would be interested in, or does it not matter enough for us to escalate it there?
Well, I mean, This is why I escalated it to the four bodies concerned, because
It was a strong letter.
yeah, I
I read it. I think I'm on here. I've been reading all day.
yeah, I mean, from Ewan's point of view, the issue is that owing to a change of auditor, owing over that period of time to a change in the way this will regulate the NAO and others work, then the actual certificate has not been issued. From my point of view, all the requisite work has been done, everything that we've been asked to provide has been provided. It's up to the other four bodies to sort out who does what so it can be provided. And I think what I've been given now as assurance is that all those bodies accept. They have to do whatever they need to do in order to resolve it, but I do not yet have a promise of a specific date.
I imagine that they would have said that at any point between then and now that it's been due.
I wish I'd written the letter 6 months ago. I mean, and I probably ought to have done, but hopefully shortly.
When you do find out, could you let us know?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, we're approaching 9 o'clock, so we need to pass the resolution to enable us to extend the meeting. So all meetings of the council close at 9 p.m, except an extension may be agreed by resolution passed before 9 p.m. to extend the meeting half an hour. As business cannot be 9 p.m, I propose we resolve to suspend Rule 11 standing orders under 4.1 council procedure and extend the duration of this meeting to 9:30 or until the conclusion of business, whichever is the soonest. Do I have a seconder?
Yeah.
Is that agreed?
Agreed.
The committee agreed by majority vote or the resolution fails and ends at 9 p.m. So we have agreement and the meeting will be extended. Thank you. We can now continue. Any further questions, Conrad or Andrew or Minette on the statement of accounts?
No, it'd be good to hear that. And I would also be interested to know whether at any point, or if you think at any point that we should be escalating it to a guardian of the guardians, for example.
Sure. Will do.
Yes, if you can keep us informed on that, Conrad, because as you said, it is extremely outstanding and poor show on all regards, really. Any further questions or comments on the accounts? Okay. I will now read the recommendation. Councillor Bushman. Okay, yes. I will now read the recommendation. Audit Committee is recommended to note the draft statement of accounts for 2022-23 and approve its submission to external audit. And note the comments regarding the audit certificates for the financial years from 2016-17 onwards. The members present in the room, may I see by a show of hands if the recommendation agreed?
Chair, just a clarification, did Conrad say 2014-15?
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And all subsequently, yes, there's a typo in the report, which is my fault.
Just to amend that.
No, the comments regarding the audit certificates for financial year state starting from 20, if that could be amended, please. Thank you. The members present in the room, may I see by a show of hands if the recommendation agreed? Thank you. We'll now move on to item 10, draft annual governance statement. I invite the officer, Minette Hall, to give a brief introduction to the report, and I will then open the floor to questions. Andrew.
Sorry, yeah, we clearly put the wrong names on the script.
Papers. Okay, Conrad, please.
Okay, so the annual governance statement is an important document that sets out. I think I'd divide it into three parts, if you like. You have a narrative that explains how we operate to try and make sure that we make the right sort of decisions in the right way. That's what good governance ultimately means. And I won't talk to any of the items under there that form the start of the document. Clearly, if you've got views, either on whether that's an accurate description or whether you think that's an accurate description of how things are supposed to work but don't always work in practice, then please raise them and we'll discuss them. I think the second part that I direct you to, and apologies, I don't have your the printed agenda and the page numbers of that, but towards the end of the document, you have the Head of Assurance's opinion on the control environment. So the Head of Assurance is Nicola Wood, who the committee will know.
It's 274, Conrad.
Thank you, Chair. Page 274. So you've got her independent opinion on the council's risk management systems, on the governance arrangements, and on the internal control environment. And then towards right at the end of the document, so I guess about page 280, 281 on your agenda, you have key governance issues. But firstly, we'll report on those that were identified in last year's statement, 2021-22, and you see that 3 of those 4 have been closed off. That doesn't mean that everything in respect to those needs to be done, but we've implemented the right programs of action to deal with them. For example, Ofsted is no longer a governance issue. We have been rated good. You then also have key governance issues for 2022-23, which we've identified half a dozen, 7 to be precise. I won't talk to each one, have to take questions on them. The point I would emphasise, in my view, very strongly, is that it's much the preferred approach. We could simply sort of, I'm aware that some organisations probably do this, not disclose issues. It's a bit awkward, it's a bit embarrassing. Far better, in my view, take the approach that we do, which is to be transparent about the things that we know haven't worked as they should do, or the significant risks we face around, for example, cybersecurity, IT infrastructure, and to disclose them here as part of that assurance, really, for the committee that the officers are not blind to these risks, critical, and will highlight issues that we're working on. So I think you should take them in that sense. You will, if you Google around, be able to find plenty of councils that won't disclose any governance issues. Without knowing the details of each of those, but I suspect that in at least some of those cases they probably ought to have done. But that's the approach that we take and the reason why. I'll pause there in the interest of time and have to take questions on any elements of that.
I'll just ask Conrad a question first. On 274, where the Chief Internal Auditor does say limited assurance over the control environment, we haven't seen any improvement from last year. We're still at limited. So can you just give on, I don't know, what your Head of Assurance opinion? So the third bullet point down, the limited assurance over the internal control environment.
Yeah, I mean, the statement there is clear. So during last year's work, you've seen examples of controls that aren't as strong as they ought to be. For example, around GDPR compliance, the appraisal process, contract waivers, and so on. So it's an acknowledged weakness. I think I would highlight the paragraph following that. Well, I think Nicola very sensibly points that with the range of activities that we do, trying to summarise that down to one word is really not very realistic. So you shouldn't read from that that applies across the board. You'll be well aware of audits that were completed last year, that showed an error, operating entirely as intended. And again, I'd kind of come back to my point. Far better to be transparent about that, where we know we need to do more, and we're continuing to do so. But there's more work to be done in that area. That is acknowledged.
Yeah, just concerned about where she says the pockets of weak practice. It's just a repetition, and just to be sure that we're moving in the right direction, because even though the council provides diverse services and there's lots of different things, we need to see that movement, that we can move from limited in the control environment. How do we get to moderate assurance? That's the concern.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the answer to that, one, the follow-up audits on those areas will then provide assurance, I hope, or not as the case may be, where we've identified weaknesses, we've then taken action to address them. Better, I know, not to have the weaknesses in the first place, but at least if you're confident that once we've done that, we then put it right, that's an important step. We emphasise continually to managers, the importance of this, that whatever the pressures that will always exist in any organisation to deliver things quickly, to get on with it, these are core priorities or whatever, it always means get on with it quickly in the right way.
Indeed.
Controls are in place, for really good reasons. We need to keep our focus on that area. I agree.
Thank you, Conrad.
I'd like it to be there.
Thank you. Councillor Chadder, please.
Couple of questions. Glad to see the constitutional review is going ahead, because I think there's been some confusion amongst us as members. And we were always anticipating it was about to start, so I'm glad to see that is on the plan. Just from a technical point of view, when the government statement is it written to the point of the end of March, or is it written including information that's most contemporary? So the reason why I'm asking is in charity accounts, when you sign up a charity's accounts, you can write until the moment that the management committee have signed it off. Is that the same situation?
Yeah, I mean that's the same with the council's accounts, and the same principle applies on the annual governance statement. So although it sort of covers the 22-23 year, if something happened on the 1st of April or indeed on 28th of June that I thought was relevant to it, we would add it.
So it's right up until the point of signature. So, okay. And then my second point is around two final points. Page 266, the outline governance framework in Newham. And it may not be something for this report, but it is something that I think we need to pick up again, because it doesn't look like anyone's talking to anyone. Or am I reading this diagram wrong? Because it just
well, we did wonder about putting this in. I mean, it's certainly not intended to convey the impression that nobody is talking to that, but it's just trying in the different committees and departments. I mean, that does not mean that the digital team doesn't talk to the environmental sustainable transport team or anything like that. I mean, the diagram doesn't work, then we'll think about a better presentation or maybe not include it, but it's certainly not intended to give that impression.
I'm sure. I think it's the use of the word governance there. So governance would apply an element of control or an element of accountability. And this doesn't really say it. I know it's there, but I'm not sure that we're articulating it in a way. So are we actually saying this is a structure as opposed to a governance framework?
So what we were trying to get across, is you have the decision making at the top, mayor and cabinet exercising executive powers, and full council as well, and that they sit over various committees, including this one, who contribute to the middle bit of the kind of bringing together of the work of all of the departments to produce, for example, management reports and so on, and then the departmental structure under that. So it's intended to convey a sort of seniority of decision making within the organisation. It's clearly not working. That's all. Think about a better presentation.
To that effect,
Yeah.
it might just help. I mean, maybe next year we can do something else. My final point, Chair, on page 279, we talk about one of the risks being scrutiny. And I know we've raised this in other places, and I'm concerned to find that we're saying that a report has been commissioned when we already know that a report is still outstanding. So is that not a risk in itself, that we're not following up on the actions that we've already started?
No, I don't think so. I mean, as is well known, the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny produced a draft report, which is in the process of being finalised after admittedly a long delay that we talked about at some length before. But I don't think there's other than the fact of the delay that we've discussed at length previously, I don't think that there's a concern there. Draft report has been produced. We are doing the work in order to finalise that, so that there's some proper conclusions to rely on.
There are two reports, aren't
Huh?
There is.
there? Not two reports? That's what we were led to believe over the scrutiny.
First report, part draft.
Well known that the process around that, got derailed in some way back in, early 20, but around about a year ago or something like that. You ought not to think of it as two reports. There was a draft report that was produced and not properly finalised around about a year ago or so. So we therefore brought the Centre for Governance Scrutiny back in to finalise their own report. We see that will mean there's a draft and final report. So at some stage that means there are two reports. But I wouldn't think of that as two reports. That's just the ordinary process of producing something.
Just that.
Councillor Paul.
But the first report wasn't marked draft, Conrad. It was issued by the Centre for Governance. And I will say, and I put it on the record, members were misled by a scrutiny officer as to the existence of that report. And that needs to be put on record. It is a public meeting and I'm willing to stand by my comments. I just want to put it on the record. Members were misled as to this report.
We need to remain.
Chair, I will clarify for the record. I'm happy what I'm said and I'm willing for my comment to be tested.
But this isn't an appropriate forum.
I think it is, Chair.
It's not an appropriate forum. Because you're aware of the issues with this. So if there are any other questions regarding.
I have, Chair, actually. Thank you very much. On the cabinet accountability model section here, it doesn't provide assurance or transparency. For example, where would a resident find out the details and the effectiveness of these stock takes? This is the organisation saying what it's doing, but there's nowhere a resident can test the viability of what was done in their name, like a comment there. And secondly, on the overview section on scrutiny, there's a section which says, one of the mechanisms of non-executive members to refer key decisions is the issue of the calling process. This year, a cabinet decision on progressing James Riley Point was referred to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee for review through the council's calling process, with recommendation provided for the executive's consideration. I think it more accurate, Chair, to put in there, but it related to an overspend of 25 million and the executive decided not to take any of the considerations of the calling process. I think that would be a fairer and more accurate record than what is put here in this thing. And obviously, I wasn't there at the meeting. Councillor Booker was, and Councillor Booker might want to add to what I just said.
I can't remember whether not all of them were taken. I think actually one might have been, but it was a relatively
Minor.
Yeah, it was a relatively minor one.
On that, please.
So 2 points to that then. So the governance framework in a local authority includes your formal decision making, public meetings such as cabinet, or very strictly speaking, meeting in public, as well as public meetings like this that are about holding the executive to account. Like any local authority, in order to get public reports and decisions to those meetings, there will be a series of internal discussions on them. So it is normal and reasonable that the council should hold those meetings and that they are not open to residents to look at, because the outcome of those meetings, for example, decisions proposed to cabinet, take place in public. Any local authority, any public body, well recognised in case law, in freedom of information case law, is entitled to consider policy in private and then publish its views and the reasons for the decisions it proposes to take and so on. So, I don't think it is ought to be of any concern that there are meetings of that nature that take place in order to make sure that we then get public decisions made in the right way. On the call-in, my view, is that shows the strengths of the council's decision-making process. There's a scrutiny function that has the right and the responsibility of holding the executive to account. It considered a decision that cabinet had taken and thought at the very least, a different decision ought to have been taken, or there should have been modifications to it, or we can debate the exact semantics of that. But that is precisely a statement that Newham's governance arrangements, which are by no means limited just to the executive, do work in the way that they intend, the way that they are intended. The fact that the scrutiny committee call-in reached a different decision to council, or recommended a different decision to the one that cabinet had taken, doesn't mean that there's a weakness or a failure in governance. It's entirely possible for different groups of reasonable people to come to different conclusions. The point is that the decisions that cabinet have taken are subject to that challenge, to that public scrutiny. So people can watch the meeting if they want to. It was held in public. But clearly, Councillor Ball is entirely entitled to his view that cabinet reached the wrong decision. It's a perfectly legitimate view to hold, but I don't think the annual governance statement warrants amendment for that on the basis that that's the process working the way it's intended. It may entirely lawful and reasonable that scrutiny and the executive may just have different.
Yeah, my point wasn't that there was a divergence of view. My point was the full information should be included in the report. My comment wasn't about some decisions were taken and the executive didn't listen to that. That was not the core of my proposition. My proposition was to improve the transparency of this statement. It will be more clearer to say what the calling was about, and if the decisions were, and to say, just for transparency purposes, but the executive chose to take a different view. That's all I said. So
it's a matter of public record, and we can either cross-reference it or add it into this document. The reasons for the call-in were public. Those you can either add those into this document, or perhaps for convenience add a hyperlink cross-reference.
Yeah, I mean, perfect.
That then I have no issue with that at all.
Yeah, if you could do that, please, Conrad, that would be helpful. Councillor Penton, please.
Yeah, just one, possibly two questions. Going back to the Councillor Chadder mentioned the role of councillors.
So ultimately, the constitution is a matter for council to decide. So that, that's the final sort of decision making on this. I know that the person sort of leading on the review, a very experienced lawyer, will be talking not necessarily to all councillors, but to councillors as part of that. For example, to understand which parts of the constitution are seen to work well or poorly. I can get, because I don't know the precise detail of exactly how that, I can get a detailed update on that, so that would be helpful. But councillors are certainly involved to some extent in the work to it, and the decision sits with councillors.
Maybe explaining how the constitutional review is conducted and how it will be developed, and the recommendations that will then come to council will be really quite helpful.
The terms of reference of the work would be helpful. That would specify what work will cover. Would be the
timeline.
Well, that should be in the terms of reference.
I'll get those circulated.
Thank you.
And just
Okay, any further comments on the draft annual government statement? Okay. I will now read the recommendation. Audit Committee is recommended to note the draft annual government statement as set out in Appendix 1 to members present in the room. May I see by a show of hands if the recommendation agreed? Thank you. Item 11, year ahead forward plan. This report sets out the items to be considered for the year. I ask the committee to consider if any items should be added to the forward plan, which can be discussed further when audit officers are present at the next ordinary meeting. I would like an update on the independent member vacancy at the next meeting. Any comments? Councillor Chadder?
And it's something that was again cross-referenced by overviewing scrutiny. And this is a genuine question, is there a space or is there an aspect of the one source discussion that should be discussed at audit as well? Maybe late towards the end of the financial year?
Of course you can. I think you should talk to scrutiny, because we're clear which group of members is doing that. I'll repeat the advice I gave at the scrutiny work planning meeting. I mean, policy decision has been taken in cabinet and it's not called in. Principally what you have now is an HR process to affect that split. But at the end, a sort of lessons learned, did it work well operationally review might well be sensible. I just would ask that perhaps there's a discussion between audit and scrutiny as to which body is best placed to carry that out.
Thanks for the push to that forward.
Yes, thank you.
Any further questions?
Sorry, I said earlier that I'd read it all, and actually I haven't read this page. So earlier you spoke about the 5 things that you're doing to look at the grant thorn areas. When are they coming up? Are they within this?
They certainly should be. Let me just run to check. Right. No, you're quite right. The report is deficient in that sense. They're certainly on the work plan, but they haven't found their way into this document. I am pretty certain that the next part of that won't be complete for your July meeting. It might be now that that's been put back towards the end of July, but I'll check. So I would have thought that October is the plausible date for those. So the remaining parts are the review of companies, the audit committee's review of its own effectiveness, and one other part. So I'll check and get this document updated. It's missing those. And
Thank you, Conrad. Any further comments? Questions?
Are we at liberty to request an internal audit to look at a specific area of work?
You are, of course you are, and we're keen on views on that. So obviously it's a request and we consider the reasons for it alongside all the other things they might need to do. But if you want to do that now or later to me directly, then of course, we'll happily consider it.
Any further comments, questions? To members present in the room, may I start by show of hands, is the report noted? Thank you. Item 12, date of the next meeting. The date of the next meeting is scheduled for the 27th of July, 2023. This concludes tonight's business. Before we end the meeting, I'd like to wish good night to everyone who is watching on YouTube. I now declare the